My evil stepmother fired me from my own family's famous restaurant, laughing as her security guards threw me out into the dirty alleyway by the dumpsters. She told the entire world that her lazy, arrogant son was the real genius behind our Michelin-star food. But she had absolutely no idea that she just fired the only person keeping them from total financial ruin. Let me back up and tell you how this whole nightmare started. For nearly 10 long years, I was the hidden backbone of the veranda dining group. My father built this incredible restaurant empire from scratch, starting with just a tiny corner bistro and working his fingers to the bone to turn it into a massive multi-million-dollar business. But after he passed away unexpectedly, his second wife, Beatrice, used a bunch of shady legal tricks to take complete control of everything he had built. The very first thing she did was make her biological son, Julian, the executive head chef. To the rich customers and the local news reporters, Julian looked like an absolute superstar. He wore these bright white, custom-tailored chef coats that cost an absolute fortune, and he spent every single night walking around the expensive dining room, shaking hands with politicians, and taking pictures with local celebrities. He played the part of the tortured, brilliant artist perfectly. But here is the ugly truth that nobody outside the kitchen doors knew. Julian was a complete fraud. He could not even cook a basic scrambled egg without burning the pan and setting off the smoke alarms. He had absolutely no idea how to mix spices, how to prepare a proper sauce, or how to manage the intense chaos of a massive commercial kitchen. He was just a pretty face for the cameras. I was the one doing all the actual heavy lifting. I woke up at 4 in the morning every single day without fail. I went down into the freezing prep kitchens before the sun even came up to get everything ready. I created every single recipe on our famous menu. I trained all the line cooks, and most importantly, I managed the relationships with all of our high-end food suppliers. My father always taught me that a restaurant is only as good as its ingredients, so I worked hard to make sure we got the best organic vegetables, the freshest ocean seafood, and the highest quality beef in the entire city. Beatrice and Julian treated me like absolute garbage. They acted like letting me work there was some kind of massive favor, calling me a glorified kitchen assistant behind my back, while they collected all the profits and the awards. But the breaking point finally happened on the biggest night of the entire year. We were hosting a massive, highly publicized dinner for a famous food foundation, and the dining room was packed with the most ruthless food critics in the country. Right before the dinner service started, Julian decided he wanted to change the menu to make himself look like a creative genius. He wanted to serve a raw seafood dish, but he completely ignored the basic rules of temperature control. I looked at his crazy plan and told him straight to his face that if we served that dish, we were going to give food poisoning to 100 rich people. Julian threw a massive tantrum like a spoiled toddler. He started screaming and throwing expensive plates across the room. Beatrice came storming into the kitchen, wearing a heavy diamond necklace that was paid for by my hard work. She didn't care about food safety or the customers at all. She only cared about protecting her precious son's fragile ego. Right there, in front of 30 cooks and waiters, she started screaming at me. She told me I was just a jealous, useless assistant who was trying to ruin Julian's big night. She told me to pack my knives and leave immediately. Then, she actually called the security guards to physically drag me out of my own father's kitchen. As the heavy metal door slammed shut in my face, I could hear them cheering inside. They really thought they had won. They thought they had finally gotten rid of the annoying stepdaughter. What they didn't realize was that by kicking me out, they just lit a match and threw it right onto their own gasoline-soaked empire. They were popping expensive champagne inside, thinking they had finally gotten rid of me for good, but they had absolutely no idea I was about to completely cut off their entire food supply. Standing there in the cold, dirty alleyway next to the overflowing dumpsters, I didn't shed a single tear. I wasn't sad, and I definitely wasn't defeated. Actually, I was smiling. My stepmother Beatrice and my useless stepbrother Julian thought they were so incredibly smart, but there was a massive secret my father had kept from them before he passed away. My dad knew exactly how greedy and heartless his new wife was, and he knew she would eventually try to push me out of the family business. Because he loved me and wanted to protect me, he secretly set up a massive offshore trust fund in my name. We are talking about millions of dollars that Beatrice couldn't touch, couldn't see, and didn't even know existed. For the past 3 years, while she was treating me like a lowly kitchen maid and paying me minimum wage, I had been secretly using that hidden money to build my own private corporate empire from a highly secured office downtown. I brushed the dirt off my chef's pants, hailed a yellow cab right off the street, and told the driver to take me straight to that office. As I watched the city lights flash by the window, I decided it was finally time to pull the trigger on a revenge plan I had been holding in my back pocket for years. You see, the funny thing about the luxury restaurant business is that a fancy dining room is absolutely worthless if you don't have the food to serve your rich customers. If you don't have the absolute best cuts of meat, the freshest ocean fish caught that same morning, and the rarest organic vegetables, your restaurant is just an empty room with expensive tables and nice lighting. The Veranda Group relied heavily on two major supply companies to deliver 85% of their high-end ingredients. Those independent companies only gave our restaurant those amazing, cheap deals because the owners were old, loyal friends of my father, and they trusted me personally to keep the quality high. Beatrice and Julian were way too arrogant, too stupid, and too lazy to ever go down to the docks or the farms to meet the suppliers themselves. They just expected the magic delivery trucks to show up at the back door every single morning at dawn, like clockwork. So the moment I walked into my private office, I sat down at my massive desk, opened my laptop, and used my secret trust fund to buy both of those supply companies right then and there. I didn't just buy a small share or a little stock. I bought the whole entire operation with straight cash. In the blink of an eye, I became the absolute boss of the biggest food supply chain in the entire city. It cost me a small fortune, but it was worth every single penny to see the trap finally snap shut. I immediately picked up my office phone and called the head dispatch managers at both of my newly purchased warehouses. I gave them one simple, extremely strict order: cut off the Veranda Group completely, right this very second. I told them to rip up all of Beatrice's delivery contracts and throw them in the trash. I blocked their delivery address in the computer system and put the entire restaurant group on a permanent, non-negotiable blacklist. There would be no more fresh Wagyu beef, no more wild-caught salmon, and no more expensive truffles showing up at Julian's back door ever again. If my stepbrother wanted to play the role of a master celebrity chef on national television, he was going to have to do it with completely empty refrigerators. I sat back in my comfortable leather chair, looked out at the beautiful city skyline from my window, and watched the clock slowly tick down. I knew that Friday night was just around the corner, and Friday night was always their biggest, busiest, and most profitable night of the whole week. Hundreds of rich, demanding customers had booked tables months in advance, fully expecting a perfect 5-star meal. And Julian, the fake chef who couldn't even boil a pot of water without me holding his hand, was about to walk into a giant kitchen that had absolutely zero food to cook. They thought they were kicking me out to take full control, but they were actually walking right into a massive disaster they could not escape. I poured myself a hot cup of coffee, put my feet up on the desk, and waited for the beautiful chaos to begin. It was exactly 5 o'clock on a Friday evening when my arrogant stepbrother finally opened the kitchen doors and realized his entire fake cooking career was completely over. Outside in the front of the restaurant, things looked absolutely perfect. The valet drivers were busy parking expensive sports cars, the hostesses were wearing beautiful black dresses, and the massive crystal chandeliers in the dining room were shining brightly. The grand veranda was fully booked for the night. Over 200 of the richest, most demanding people in the city were sitting at their tables, ready to spend hundreds of dollars on a single meal. They were expecting perfection. They were expecting the famous celebrity chef Julian to blow their minds with the finest ingredients money could buy. But inside the kitchen, a massive nightmare was just beginning to unfold. Normally, at this time of the day, the giant walk-in refrigerators would be packed to the ceiling with fresh deliveries. There should have been huge boxes of expensive Wagyu beef sitting on the bottom shelves, shiny silver trays filled with wild-caught lobsters and sea bass, and crates bursting with rare, organic vegetables that were picked just hours ago. But when Julian proudly marched into the kitchen, wearing his spotless white chef coat, and pulled open the heavy metal door of the main refrigerator, his jaw dropped straight to the floor. The refrigerator was completely empty. There was nothing inside except bare metal shelves and cold air. Julian started panicking immediately. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, yelling at the loyal sous chefs I had trained, demanding to know where his food was. The kitchen staff was terrified and totally confused. They told him that the delivery trucks simply never showed up this morning. They said they tried calling the supply companies all day, but nobody was picking up the phones. Julian's face turned bright red, and sweat started pouring down his forehead. He grabbed the kitchen phone and dialed the private emergency number for Apex Agricultural Distribution, completely unaware that I was now the owner of that entire company. A dispatcher answered the phone and coldly told Julian that the Veranda Group's account had been permanently closed. The dispatcher read the exact words I had given him. "Your delivery contract is canceled, your address is blacklisted, and we will never send another truck to your restaurant ever again." Julian started cursing and throwing pots across the room, which finally brought my stepmother Beatrice running into the kitchen. She was wearing her expensive designer dress, furious that Julian was making so much noise, while rich guests were sitting just on the other side of the dining room doors. When Julian told her that the suppliers had cut them off, Beatrice rolled her eyes, thinking it was just a stupid clerical error. She grabbed the phone from Julian's shaking hands, completely confident that she could bully the supplier into sending a truck right away. She started yelling into the receiver, using her usual snobby voice, threatening to sue them and ruin their business if they didn't bring her food right this second. The dispatcher didn't argue. He just hung up the phone right in her ear. For the first time in her life, Beatrice looked truly terrified. The reality of the situation finally hit them both like a speeding train. They had a dining room full of millionaires, food critics, and VIP guests expecting the best meal of their lives, and they had absolutely zero food to cook for them. The panic in the kitchen was spreading like wildfire. The waiters were asking when the first plates would be ready, and Beatrice knew she had to do something desperate. She grabbed her purse, pulled out a stack of $100 bills, and shoved them into the hands of two teenage dishwashers. She told them to run to the cheap, local chain grocery store down the street and buy as much regular, low-quality meat and frozen vegetables as they could carry. Julian looked like he was going to throw up. He was a complete fraud who only knew how to take credit for my amazing recipes. He knew he didn't have the real skills to take cheap, rubbery grocery store steak and make it taste like a 5-star meal. Meanwhile, I was sitting comfortably in my fancy new office downtown, watching the GPS trackers on my delivery trucks driving right past their street. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, smiled at the computer screen, and knew that Julian was about to serve the worst dinner in the history of the city. The trap was locked, and there was absolutely no way out. The teenage dishwashers came sprinting through the back door of the kitchen carrying cheap plastic bags full of frozen grocery store food. And in that exact moment, Julian's fake cooking career officially began to burn to the ground. It was an absolute, unavoidable disaster waiting to happen. The bags were filled with the cheapest, lowest quality ingredients you could possibly imagine. There were blocks of rubbery, prepackaged steak that looked completely gray and lifeless, frozen bags of chopped carrots and peas covered in thick white freezer burn, and sticks of fake, artificial butter that smelled like pure chemicals. Julian just stood there staring at the cheap plastic grocery bags, his hands shaking so badly that he actually dropped his expensive, custom-made chef's knife right onto the floor. For years, he had been taking all the credit for my beautiful, complicated recipes that required fresh, high-end ingredients to taste perfect. Now, he was forced to cook cheap, discount bin meat for a dining room full of millionaires who were paying $500 a plate. He started throwing the frozen steaks onto the hot grills, but because he had absolutely no idea how to properly control the heat, the meat immediately started to burn and turn black on the outside while staying completely frozen solid on the inside. The entire kitchen quickly filled with the horrible, stinging smell of burnt fat and cheap cooking oil. The waiters were getting extremely anxious, constantly checking their watches because the rich customers out in the dining room were starting to complain loudly about the long wait. Beatrice was running around the kitchen in a blind panic, her expensive heels clicking on the tile, screaming at Julian to hurry up and just put the food on the plates so they could get it out to the tables. So Julian did exactly that. He slapped the burnt, rubbery steaks onto the fancy white porcelain plates, scooped some soggy, microwaved vegetables right next to them, and poured a thick, salty, pre-made brown gravy all over the top to try and hide the terrible smell and the awful presentation. The waiters looked absolutely horrified as they picked up the heavy trays, but they had no choice because Beatrice was screaming at them to move. They pushed through the swinging kitchen doors and carried the cheap grocery store food out into the beautiful, candle-lit dining room. I was sitting comfortably in my office across town, watching the entire disaster unfold in real time through the secret security camera feeds I had installed in the dining room years ago to monitor the wait staff. The moment the plates hit the tables, you could physically see the total confusion on the customers' faces. The food looked sloppy, greasy, and completely unappetizing. A famous local food critic, a man who had praised our restaurant just a month ago when I was the one doing the cooking, was sitting at the best table right in the center of the room. I watched the camera feed closely as he took his very first bite of Julian's ruined, rubbery steak. The critic immediately gagged, grabbed his white linen napkin, and spit the chewed food out right into his hand in total disgust. Within 10 minutes, the entire dining room was in absolute chaos. Angry customers were aggressively calling the waiters over, pushing their full plates away, and loudly demanding to see the manager immediately. People were complaining that the meat was impossible to chew, the vegetables were freezing cold in the middle, and the sauce tasted like cheap canned soup from a gas station. Several tables actually stood up, threw their napkins down on the floor, and walked right out the front door into the night without paying a single dime. The food critics pulled out their smartphones right at the table and immediately started posting terrible, brutal reviews on the internet for thousands of people to see. Beatrice tried to run out into the dining room to do damage control, offering free bottles of expensive wine to calm everyone down, but nobody cared about her fake apologies. They wanted their money back, and they wanted to know why they were being served cheap garbage at a luxury restaurant. Back in the kitchen, Julian was hiding in the corner by the sinks, holding his head in his hands and crying like a little baby, while the plates of uneaten food came crashing back through the swinging doors. He had finally been exposed as a total fraud in front of the entire city. I took another slow sip of my coffee, scrolled through the hilarious, angry reviews popping up on my phone, and smiled to myself because the best part of my revenge plan hadn't even started yet. The internet was already tearing their fake reputation into tiny little pieces, but while Beatrice and Julian were busy crying over bad restaurant reviews, I was sending the federal health inspectors straight to their front door to shut them down forever. I knew exactly how my lazy, incompetent stepbrother operated when nobody was holding his hand, and I knew his kitchen was secretly a disgusting, dangerous biohazard. Because he was always trying to skim a little extra cash off the top to pay for his fancy lifestyle, Julian had developed a terrible habit of ignoring basic food safety rules whenever I wasn't around to force him to do his job right. While the angry customers in the dining room were still yelling at the waiters and demanding refunds for their burnt, rubbery grocery store steaks, a fleet of plain white government vans quietly pulled up to the front curb of the grand veranda. The heavy glass front doors swung open, but it wasn't more rich customers walking inside. It was a team of 6 grim-faced, no-nonsense investigators from the Municipal Department of Health, all wearing matching windbreakers and carrying heavy metal clipboards, bright flashlights, and digital thermometers. They did not wait for a hostess to seat them, and they absolutely did not care about the fancy crystal chandeliers or the expensive piano music playing in the corner. They marched in a straight line right through the middle of the crowded dining room, ignoring the shocked gasps of the wealthy guests, and pushed their way straight through the swinging metal doors right into the heart of the kitchen. Julian was still hiding in the corner by the dirty dish sinks, sweating and shaking, when the lead health inspector shined a blinding white flashlight directly into his face. The inspector demanded to see the daily temperature logs, the meat delivery invoices, and the cross-contamination records. Julian just stared at him with a blank, stupid look on his face because he had absolutely no idea what those papers even were. For years, I was the one who meticulously filled out every single safety log and made sure the kitchen was sparkling clean before we closed for the night. Without me there, Julian had let the entire place turn into an absolute nightmare in just a few short days. The inspectors didn't wait for Julian to answer. They immediately spread out across the kitchen and started tearing the place apart. The things they found in the next 20 minutes were so horrifying that they actually made one of the junior inspectors gag out loud. They went to the main prep stations and found raw, bloody chicken juices dripping directly onto the cutting boards where the chefs were chopping the salad vegetables. They checked the commercial dishwasher and discovered that the water was barely lukewarm because Julian had secretly turned down the main water heater to save a few dollars on the monthly utility bill, meaning absolutely none of the plates or silverware going out to the dining room were being properly sanitized. But the absolute worst discovery happened when the lead inspector walked over to the secondary walk-in refrigerator located way in the back corner of the kitchen. When the inspector pulled the heavy metal handle and opened the door, a terrible, sickening smell flooded out into the room. This was the fridge where Julian hid the cheap, expired ingredients he bought from unlicensed, back-alley vendors to cut corners on the budget. The inspector's flashlight hit a massive plastic storage bin sitting on the bottom shelf, completely uncovered. Inside the bin was a pile of old, rotting seafood that was literally covered in a thick layer of fuzzy green mold and dripping a disgusting, cloudy slime onto the floor. The temperature inside the fridge was a warm 50 degrees, meaning every single piece of food in that room was a massive breeding ground for dangerous, deadly bacteria. Beatrice came rushing into the kitchen, her expensive high heels slipping on the greasy floor, and tried to use her usual snobby attitude to bully the government agents. She started screaming that she was personal friends with the mayor, threatening to have all the inspectors fired if they didn't leave her restaurant immediately. She even reached into her designer purse and tried to hand a thick stack of $100 bills to the lead inspector to make the problem go away. The inspector looked at the bribe, looked right into Beatrice's terrified eyes, and pulled a bright red pad of paper out of his pocket. He calmly wrote out a mandatory, non-negotiable closure order right on the spot. He told Beatrice in a loud, clear voice that her restaurant was officially condemned as a severe public health hazard, and that she was facing massive criminal fines for endangering the lives of her customers. The inspectors ordered every single cook, waiter, and dishwasher to drop whatever they were doing and evacuate the building immediately. Then, the lead inspector walked out into the dining room, interrupted the piano player, and loudly announced to the remaining rich customers that the kitchen was a biohazard and that the building was being shut down by the federal government. The guests gasped in horror, dropped their forks, and started running for the front door, absolutely disgusted that they had almost eaten in such a filthy place. The health inspectors marched Beatrice and Julian right out the front doors, humiliated them in front of a huge crowd of people who had gathered on the sidewalk with their camera phones recording everything, and wrapped a heavy metal chain around the gold handles of the restaurant. They snapped a massive steel padlock onto the chain and taped a giant red warning sign to the glass that said, "Closed by the health department," in big, bold letters. Back in my secure office, I watched the live video feed of Beatrice crying on the sidewalk while Julian tried to hide his face from the cameras. I picked up my phone and called my team of elite financial lawyers because closing the restaurant was only step one. Now that their income was completely dead, the bank was going to come looking for their money, and I was going to be the one holding the collection plate. The heavy steel padlock on the front doors of the restaurant wasn't just keeping the angry customers out. It was permanently locking away every single penny my evil stepmother had left to her name. Beatrice was incredibly arrogant, but she was also terribly stupid when it came to managing real money. When my father passed away, he left her a highly profitable, debt-free business. But Beatrice didn't just want to be wealthy. She wanted to live like a billionaire movie star. Over the years, she had secretly taken out massive, high-interest commercial bank loans using the restaurant building as collateral so she could fund her ridiculous, luxury lifestyle. She used the bank's money to buy herself endless diamond necklaces, expensive designer dresses, and a massive suburban mansion with a heated swimming pool. She even bought Julian a bright red, custom-ordered Ferrari just to make him look like a successful celebrity chef when he pulled up to the valet stand. But those massive bank loans came with a very strict, dangerous rule hidden in the fine print. The rules stated that if the flagship restaurant ever stopped generating daily revenue, or if it lost its operating licenses, the bank had the legal right to freeze all of her accounts and demand every single dollar back immediately. When Beatrice woke up on Saturday morning, just hours after the health inspectors raided the kitchen and humiliated her on live television, she was still completely delusional. She genuinely believed she could just call her expensive corporate lawyers on Monday morning, pay a small fine, and make the whole nightmare disappear. She decided to go to an exclusive, high-end shopping boutique downtown to buy some new shoes to make herself feel better about the terrible reviews on the internet. She picked out 3 pairs of expensive boots, walked up to the cash register with her nose in the air, and handed her shiny platinum credit card. The cashier swiped the card, looked at the computer screen with a confused expression, and swiped it again. The machine started beeping loudly, flashing a bright red message that said the card was completely declined. Beatrice was furious. She started screaming at the poor cashier, calling her an idiot, and pulled out 2 different gold cards from her designer purse. Both of those cards were declined too. Embarrassed and shaking with anger, Beatrice ran out to her luxury SUV and called her personal banker, ready to threaten the man's job. But when the customer service agent answered, the tone of his voice was ice cold. He told Beatrice that the bank's fraud and collections department had seen the breaking news about the restaurant being condemned by the federal government. Because her primary source of income was completely shut down by the health department, the bank had officially pulled the plug. They had permanently frozen her checking accounts, her savings accounts, and every single line of credit she had. She couldn't even buy a cup of coffee. Meanwhile, back at the giant mansion, Julian was waking up with a terrible hangover from the disaster the night before. He walked out onto the front porch in his expensive silk pajamas just in time to see a massive, heavy-duty tow truck backing into their long driveway. 2 huge guys with clipboards hopped out, chained up Julian's bright red Ferrari, and started dragging it up onto the flatbed truck. Julian started screaming, running barefoot down the driveway, waving his arms and demanding they drop his car. The tow truck driver just laughed in his face, handed him a piece of paper that said his lease payments had bounced, and drove away with the only thing Julian actually cared about. While their entire fake, plastic world was collapsing around them, I was sitting comfortably in my beautiful, quiet office downtown with my team of elite financial lawyers. I explained to my lawyers exactly how much debt Beatrice was drowning in, and I told them it was time to make our biggest move yet. You see, local banks absolutely hate bad publicity. To a bank, a condemned restaurant covered in health violations is just toxic garbage. They wanted to get rid of Beatrice's loans as fast as humanly possible before they lost all their money. I instructed my lawyers to contact the banking consortium, immediately using the name of my anonymous shell company, Vanguard Holdings. We offered to buy all of Beatrice's massive debt right on the spot. We offered them straight, hard cash from my secret trust fund, but we only offered to pay pennies on the dollar. The banks were so desperate to escape the PR nightmare of the Veranda Group scandal that they signed the paperwork and took my cash almost immediately. In less than 48 hours after the health inspectors shut down the kitchen, I legally owned the mortgage to the flagship restaurant. I owned the massive loan on Beatrice's giant suburban mansion. I even owned the debt on Julian's remaining luxury cars. I wasn't just a former chef anymore. I was officially their absolute biggest and only creditor. I held their entire lives in the palm of my hand. Back at the mansion, Beatrice was sitting in the dark because the electric company had just shut off the power due to a bounced auto payment. The mail carrier walked up to the porch and dropped a thick, heavy legal envelope into the mailbox. Beatrice ripped it open with shaking hands. It was an official notice of total asset foreclosure from Vanguard Holdings. The letter explicitly stated that she had exactly 3 days to pay back millions of dollars in cash, or she would be thrown out on the street and her home would be auctioned off. She dropped the paper on the floor, absolutely terrified, crying in the dark because she had no idea who Vanguard Holdings was. She had no idea that she was about to go to an all-out war with the stepdaughter she had just thrown in the trash. The absolute worst part about losing all of your money overnight is the heavy, suffocating silence that fills your house when the phones finally stop ringing because your rich friends want absolutely nothing to do with you. Beatrice woke up on Monday morning wrapped in expensive silk sheets, but she was shivering because the power company had completely shut off the electricity to her giant suburban mansion. The massive house was freezing cold, totally dark, and felt completely empty. She stumbled out of bed, grabbed her dead cell phone, and realized she couldn't even charge it. She had to run down to the garage and sit inside her husband's old backup car, turning the engine on just so she could plug her phone into the dashboard charger. The moment the phone screen lit up, she didn't call a lawyer or an accountant. Her massive ego told her to call her powerful friends. For years, Beatrice had thrown incredibly expensive parties, giving free food and free drinks to the mayor, local politicians, and the richest socialites in the entire city. She genuinely believed that because she had bought them expensive champagne in the past, they would immediately rush to her rescue and force the health department to reopen her restaurant. She dialed the private, unlisted cell phone number of the city's mayor, expecting him to pick up on the first ring like he always did when he wanted a free table on a Friday night. The phone rang exactly one time before it was sent straight to a cold, automated voicemail box. She left a frantic, demanding message, telling the mayor that he owed her a massive favor and that he needed to fix this health inspector mess immediately. Then she called the head of the local business council, a woman she used to play tennis with every single weekend. That woman actually answered the phone, but the moment she heard Beatrice's voice, her tone turned incredibly nasty. The woman told Beatrice that the entire city had seen the disgusting, viral videos of the rotting food inside her kitchen. She told Beatrice that she was a total embarrassment to the community and explicitly warned her never to call that number again before slamming the phone down. Beatrice sat in the freezing car, staring at the steering wheel in total shock. Her entire fake, plastic world was crumbling into dust. She wasn't a powerful restaurant queen anymore. She was a toxic joke, and nobody wanted to stand near the explosion. Back inside the dark house, Julian was having a complete mental breakdown in his massive walk-in closet. Because his sports car had been repossessed and his credit cards were completely frozen, he realized he didn't have a single dollar in cash to his name. He frantically started pulling expensive designer suits, leather jackets, and diamond watches off the shelves, stuffing them into garbage bags. He thought he could just take them to a high-end pawn shop downtown and get enough cash to hire a lawyer and fix everything. But when he finally took an Uber to the pawn shop, paying the driver with loose change he found in the couch cushions, he got the worst reality check of his entire life. The pawn shop owner took one look at Julian's shiny watches and laughed right in his face. He told Julian that half the watches were cheap, counterfeit fakes, and the designer clothes were absolutely worthless because they smelled like cheap cologne and stale smoke. Julian was given $200 for a pile of clothes that originally cost $20,000. He walked out of the store crying, finally realizing that he was completely useless in the real world. Meanwhile, Beatrice had marched back into the dark mansion and picked up the terrifying foreclosure notice from Vanguard Holdings. The letter clearly stated that her home, her restaurant, and everything she owned would be auctioned off in exactly 3 days. But Beatrice was a master manipulator, and she still thought she could cheat her way out of this trap. She looked at the name of the law firm printed at the bottom of the letter. She had no idea that Vanguard Holdings was secretly owned by me, the stepdaughter she had thrown out like garbage. She just assumed Vanguard was run by a group of old, rich, greedy businessmen. And Beatrice fully believed that she could use her fake charm, her designer clothes, and her sweet-talking lies to manipulate any old businessman in the world. She decided she was going to march right into their corporate office, demand a face-to-face emergency, meeting with the CEO of Vanguard, and negotiate a secret deal to get her restaurant back. She spent 2 hours getting ready in the dark, using a battery-powered camping lantern to do her makeup, and actually used a heavy cast-iron pan heated over a gas grill in the backyard to iron out the wrinkles in her last clean executive suit. She called the law firm from her dying cell phone and demanded an emergency sit-down, using her most arrogant, bossy voice. The receptionist at the law firm immediately put her on hold and called me directly on my private secure line. I was sitting at my massive desk, looking out over the city, when my lawyer told me that Beatrice was demanding a meeting with the boss. A massive, genuine smile spread across my face. I told the lawyer to say yes. I told him to invite her to the most expensive, intimidating glass boardroom at the very top of the tallest skyscraper in the financial district. I told him to set the meeting for 3 o'clock that exact afternoon. I hung up the phone, walked over to my private closet, and pulled out a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal power suit. I looked in the mirror and completely shed the image of the quiet, obedient kitchen assistant. I was ready to walk into that boardroom, look my evil stepmother right in the eyes, and watch her heart completely stop when she realized the person she threw in the garbage was the exact same person holding the deed to her entire life. Beatrice walked through the spinning glass doors of the towering downtown financial skyscraper, fully expecting to manipulate a room full of old, greedy businessmen. But she had absolutely no idea she was actually walking straight into a high-tech slaughterhouse designed specifically for her absolute destruction. She was wearing her very last clean designer suit, holding her expensive leather handbag tight against her chest, desperately trying to project the image of a powerful, wealthy restaurant owner. But underneath that fake, plastic mask, she was sweating through her silk shirt, her hands were shaking violently, and her heart was beating out of her chest because she knew she was completely bankrupt. She approached the massive marble security desk in the lobby, looked down her nose at the security guard, and loudly demanded the executive elevator key for her emergency meeting with Vanguard Holdings. The guard did not smile, did not apologize, and did not treat her like a VIP. He simply handed her a plastic visitor badge and pointed to the elevator bank with a cold, blank expression. As the high-speed elevator shot up 50 floors into the sky, Beatrice stood alone in the mirrored box, taking deep breaths and quietly practicing her manipulation tactics out loud. She planned to cry fake tears, play the victim, blame the entire health inspector scandal on her incompetent son Julian, and promised the hidden CEO of Vanguard Holdings a massive percentage of her future profits if they would just give her a bridge loan to save her mansion. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern corporate office filled with sleek glass walls, expensive abstract art, and dozens of people in sharp suits working silently at their computers. A perfectly dressed receptionist led Beatrice down a long hallway and opened a heavy oak door to the main executive boardroom. The room was absolutely massive, featuring a long, polished mahogany table surrounded by black leather chairs, with a giant wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city skyline. 3 older, incredibly intimidating men wearing expensive, dark gray suits were already sitting on one side of the table. These were my elite financial lawyers, the ruthless bulldogs I paid to handle my aggressive corporate takeovers. Beatrice immediately turned on her fake, charming smile, strutted into the room like she owned the place, and took a seat right across from them. She immediately started talking, using her sweet, high-pitched voice, telling the lawyers how grateful she was for this meeting and how she was ready to negotiate a very lucrative deal directly with the boss. The lead lawyer simply looked at her with totally dead, emotionless eyes, slowly closed his legal folder, and told her that the chief executive officer was walking in right now. Beatrice turned her head toward the massive double doors, putting on her best, most attractive smile, fully ready to sweet-talk some old billionaire. The heavy oak doors swung open, but it wasn't an old billionaire who walked into the room. It was me. I walked through those doors wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal power suit, my hair pulled back perfectly, flanked by 2 more corporate attorneys carrying giant stacks of financial documents. The absolute, unadulterated shock that exploded across Beatrice's face was the single most beautiful thing I have ever seen in my entire life. Her fake smile instantly vanished, her jaw dropped wide open, and all the blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a pale, terrified ghost. For a solid 10 seconds, the room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Beatrice's brain completely short-circuited. She literally could not process what her eyes were seeing. She looked at me, looked at the expensive lawyers, and then looked back at me. "Ilara, what in the world are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, confused squeak. "Did you get a job serving coffee to the lawyers?" "Get out of this room immediately. I am having a confidential financial meeting with Vanguard Holdings." I didn't say a single word at first. I just walked slowly to the absolute head of the long mahogany table, the seat of total power, and calmly sat down in the massive leather CEO chair. My elite lawyers immediately stood up, respectfully handed me the giant stack of legal folders, and sat back down in total silence. I looked right across the long table, staring directly into Beatrice's terrified, wide eyes, and finally delivered the crushing blow. "I am Vanguard Holdings, Beatrice," I stated, my voice echoing through the massive room with a cold, mathematical, and utterly terrifying precision. "I am the Chief Executive Officer. I am the sole owner of the Apex Supply Syndicate that cut off your food, and as of yesterday afternoon, I am the primary owner of every single dollar of commercial debt you owe in this world." Beatrice violently gripped the edges of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning completely white. She started shaking her head aggressively, refusing to believe the nightmare unfolding in front of her. No, that is absolutely impossible. You are just a glorified kitchen assistant. You chop onions. You don't have this kind of money," she screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. I calmly opened the thick legal folder in front of me and slid a massive, legally binding stack of total asset forfeiture documents straight across the polished wood until they hit her shaking hands. "My father knew exactly what kind of greedy, toxic monster you were, Beatrice," I explained, my voice completely devoid of any emotion or pity. "He secretly left me millions of dollars in an offshore trust fund specifically to protect me from you. While you spent the last 3 years treating me like absolute garbage and buying Julian a Ferrari, I was using that cash to map out the exact financial arteries that kept your stolen empire alive. You threw me in the alleyway because you thought you didn't need me, but you were too incredibly stupid to realize I was the only person keeping you from drowning." I pointed a single finger at the thick stack of papers sitting in front of her. "Read the bottom line, Beatrice. I didn't invite you here to negotiate a deal. I brought you here to inform you that I own your defaulted bank loans. I own the mortgage to the flagship restaurant. I own the trademarks, the recipes, and the building. And most importantly, I own the massive loan on your suburban mansion. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your cheap clothes into garbage bags and vacate my property before I have the county sheriff physically drag you and Julian out onto the front lawn." Beatrice completely collapsed backward into her leather chair, her chest heaving as she started hyperventilating. She covered her face with her shaking hands and finally started sobbing uncontrollably, completely broken and destroyed by the very girl she thought was nothing but trash. I stood up, buttoned my expensive suit jacket, and looked down at her one last time. "You told me to pack my knives and leave, Beatrice. Now I am telling you to pack your bags and get out of my city." I turned around and walked out of the massive glass boardroom, leaving her crying alone in the dark shadow of my new empire. The heavy, humiliating walk out of that towering glass skyscraper was the longest, most agonizing journey of Beatrice's entire pathetic life, because she finally knew with absolute certainty that her fake, stolen empire was completely dead and buried. She stumbled out of the revolving doors and onto the busy downtown sidewalk, her legs shaking so violently that she could barely stand up straight. She didn't have a private chauffeur waiting for her anymore. She didn't even have enough money on her frozen debit card to hail a simple yellow taxi cab to take her home. For the first time in over a decade, the queen of the veranda group had to walk 3 blocks in her expensive, painful high heels just to catch a crowded public city bus. She sat in the back corner of the noisy, dirty bus, gripping her designer handbag, staring blankly out the smeared window while regular working-class people completely ignored her. When she finally made it back to the freezing, dark suburban mansion, she found Julian sitting on the floor of the grand marble foyer, eating cold cereal out of a plastic bowl because the power was still completely shut off and the massive refrigerators had spoiled all the remaining food. Julian looked up at her with desperate, wide eyes, wiping milk off his chin, and asked if she had secured the bridge loan from the rich businessmen to save his career. Beatrice just dropped her purse on the floor, looked at her useless, arrogant son, and started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a crazy, hysterical, broken laugh that echoed through the empty, dark hallways of the giant house. She looked at Julian and screamed that there were no rich businessmen. She screamed that the anonymous CEO of Vanguard Holdings, the person who had bought their suppliers, frozen their bank accounts, and foreclosed on their massive home, was actually Alara, the quiet stepdaughter they had just thrown into the garbage alleyway a few days ago. Julian dropped his plastic cereal bowl right onto the expensive marble floor, shattering it into pieces. His brain simply refused to accept the reality of what his mother was saying. He started throwing a massive, violent tantrum, screaming that it was impossible, yelling that Alara was just a stupid, talentless kitchen assistant who didn't know anything about real money or business. He actually ran up to Beatrice and started blaming her for everything, screaming right in her face that she was a terrible mother and a horrible business manager for letting a kitchen maid steal his celebrity chef career. That was the moment their toxic, fake relationship completely shattered into a million pieces. Beatrice slapped Julian right across his face, telling him he was a lazy, talentless fraud who couldn't even cook a frozen grocery store steak without burning down the kitchen. For the next 48 hours, they completely ignored the strict eviction warning I had given them in the boardroom. Instead of using their valuable time to pack their clothes or figure out a plan, they just sat in opposite corners of the dark, freezing mansion, crying, screaming at each other, and completely paralyzed by denial. They genuinely believed that at the very last second, a judge or a lawyer would magically swoop in and save them from being thrown out onto the street. But real life doesn't care about your ego, and the laws of finance do not care about your feelings. Exactly 48 hours later, right on the dot at 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, undeniable hammer of reality finally smashed through their front door. 3 massive white police cruisers with bright, flashing red and blue lights pulled up to the front gates of the sprawling suburban estate. 4 heavy-set, no-nonsense county sheriffs stepped out of the cars, walked straight up the long brick driveway, and began aggressively pounding their heavy metal flashlights against the giant wooden front doors of the mansion. Beatrice peeked out of the upstairs window, her hair a total mess, wearing the same wrinkled clothes from 2 days ago, and let out a blood-curdling scream. The sheriffs did not wait for her to come downstairs. They used a heavy steel battering ram to completely smash the front door open, marching into the grand foyer with their hands resting on their duty belts. The lead sheriff pulled out a megaphone and loudly announced that the property was officially foreclosed, legally owned by Vanguard Holdings, and that the previous residents had exactly 10 minutes to grab whatever fit in their hands before they were physically removed from the premises for criminal trespassing. Total, absolute panic exploded inside the house. Beatrice and Julian started running around like headless chickens, frantically grabbing expensive silk shirts, diamond watches, and designer shoes, stuffing them violently into cheap black plastic garbage bags because they couldn't even find their luxury leather suitcases in the dark. 10 minutes later, the sheriffs physically grabbed Julian by the back of his shirt, dragged him out the front door, and literally threw him down onto the front lawn. They marched Beatrice out right behind him, pushing her down the front steps while she cried and begged for just 5 more minutes to pack her expensive perfumes. But the absolute worst part of their punishment wasn't the police, it was the audience. All of their wealthy, snobby neighbors, the exact same people Beatrice used to brag to at country club parties, were standing on their manicured front lawns, holding up their expensive smartphones, and recording high-definition video of the entire humiliating eviction. Beatrice tried to hide her face behind her cheap black garbage bag full of wrinkled clothes, while Julian sat in the wet grass, crying like a baby as the sheriffs wrapped a heavy steel chain around the front gates and snapped a giant padlock shut. They had absolutely no cars, no credit cards, and no cash to call an Uber. The former queen of the veranda group and her celebrity chef son were forced to carry their heavy plastic garbage bags over their shoulders and slowly walk down the side of the busy public highway, heading toward the cheapest, dirtiest motel on the bad side of town. I watched the live security camera footage of the sheriffs locking the gates from my secure office downtown, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my hot coffee. I had finally reclaimed my father's house. I had legally scrubbed the parasites from his legacy, and I knew exactly what I was going to do next to rebuild the empire they had almost completely destroyed. The bright red warning sign taped to the front window of the restaurant said the building was a condemned, dangerous health hazard, but as I stood on the sidewalk looking at it, that ugly piece of paper looked like a beautiful golden ticket to absolute freedom. Exactly 1 week after my evil stepmother and her fake celebrity chef son were physically thrown out of their mansion by the county sheriffs, I drove my car right up to the front curb of the grand veranda. I didn't have to park in the dirty back alleyway anymore, and I didn't have to sneak in through the garbage entrance like a lowly servant. I walked straight up the front steps to the massive, heavy glass doors, pulling a shiny new set of brass keys out of my pocket. These weren't just the keys to a building. They were the official, legally binding master keys to my newly conquered empire. I slid the key into the heavy steel padlock the health department had left behind, turned it with a loud click, and unwrapped the thick metal chains from the golden door handles. When I pushed the double doors open and stepped inside the dark, silent dining room, the very first thing that hit me was the absolutely terrible, rotting smell coming from the back of the building. Julian had left the kitchen in a state of total, disgusting chaos when the federal inspectors raided the place. But I didn't feel overwhelmed, and I definitely didn't feel scared. I simply reached over to the main electrical panel, flipped the massive breaker switch, and watched the expensive crystal chandeliers instantly light up the entire room. I walked slowly through the beautiful dining area, running my hand along the expensive mahogany tables, and pushed straight through the swinging metal doors right into the heart of the kitchen. It looked exactly like an active crime scene. There were still cheap, rubbery, burnt grocery store steaks sitting on the cold grills, completely covered in thick white grease. The floors were dangerously slippery, coated in spilled cooking oil and dirty dishwater. The walk-in refrigerators were filled to the ceiling with rotting vegetables, expired dairy products, and that massive, disgusting plastic bin of fuzzy, moldy seafood that had completely ruined Julian's fake career. Beatrice had refused to spend a single dime on fixing the kitchen equipment because she was too busy using the company credit cards to buy herself luxury cars and designer shoes. The main water heater was completely broken, the ventilation hoods were clogged with thick black grease, and the commercial dishwashers were basically useless. But this wasn't Julian's kitchen anymore. This was my kitchen now, and I had millions of dollars in my secret trust fund ready to fix every single mistake they had ever made. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and made 3 very important phone calls. Less than an hour later, a massive fleet of heavy-duty industrial cleaning trucks pulled up into the back alleyway. I hired an elite, 20-person hazardous material cleaning crew, and they marched into the kitchen wearing heavy rubber boots, thick yellow gloves, and high-grade breathing masks. I stood in the corner with a clipboard and directed the absolute destruction of the old regime. I watched with pure, intense satisfaction as the cleaning crew dragged out huge, heavy black garbage bags filled with Julian's rotting, cheap food and threw them right into the dumpster. We didn't just clean the kitchen, we completely gutted it. I hired professional contractors to rip out the old, greasy ovens and the broken refrigerators. Within 48 hours, massive delivery trucks arrived carrying brand new, state-of-the-art, shining stainless steel induction stoves, perfectly calibrated deep fryers, and massive, freezing cold walk-in coolers that actually worked the way they were supposed to. The entire room smelled like fresh lemon bleach and clean metal instead of stale grease and burnt meat. Once the kitchen was absolutely spotless and shining like a brand new diamond, it was time to bring the real magic back to the building. I picked up my phone and called the head dispatchers at Apex Agricultural Distribution and Oceanside Premium Meats, the 2 massive supply companies I now personally owned. I told them to open the floodgates. Early the very next morning, my own delivery trucks backed up to the loading dock. It was a beautiful sight to see the workers unloading heavy wooden crates filled with the most expensive, high-quality ingredients on the planet. We stocked the new refrigerators with hundreds of pounds of beautiful, marble-rich Wagyu beef, massive whole wild-caught salmon resting on beds of crushed ice, and delicate, hand-picked organic truffles that cost more than a used car. The kitchen was finally loaded with real ammunition, but a kitchen is nothing without an army to run it. I picked up my phone one last time and started dialing the personal numbers of the executive sous chef, the line cooks, and the dishwashers who had been fiercely loyal to me before Beatrice fired me. When the executive sous chef answered the phone, his voice sounded depressed and defeated because he thought he had permanently lost his job when the health inspectors shut the place down. I smiled and told him to put his chef coat back on and get down to the restaurant immediately. I told him that Beatrice and Julian were completely gone, completely broke, and permanently banned from the property. I told him that I was the new absolute owner, I was the new executive head chef, and I was instantly giving every single worker a massive 20% raise for their loyalty. 2 hours later, 30 of my best, most hardworking cooks walked through the back doors of the kitchen. When they saw the brand new equipment, the spotless floors, and the massive piles of premium, expensive ingredients waiting for them, some of them actually started crying tears of joy. They ran up and hugged me, completely shocked and amazed that the quiet girl Beatrice used to scream at had somehow managed to buy the entire empire out from under her. I reached into a crisp, clean cardboard box resting on the shiny metal prep table and pulled out a brand new, custom-tailored, bright white chef's coat. But this coat didn't have Julian's fake, useless name embroidered on the pocket. It had my name. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, buttoned it all the way up to my neck, and looked around at my incredibly loyal team. I clapped my hands together loudly, the sound echoing perfectly off the clean stainless steel walls, and loudly announced that it was time to get to work because we had a massive, historic grand reopening to plan. The fake celebrity chef was gone forever, and the real master of the kitchen had finally returned home to take her rightful throne. Getting secret revenge in the shadows is a very satisfying feeling, but shoving your massive, undeniable success directly into the faces of the people who doubted you is absolutely the greatest feeling in the entire world. I didn't just want to quietly open the restaurant and hope people would come back. I wanted to throw the biggest, most spectacular, and most heavily publicized grand reopening party in the history of the city, specifically designed to completely erase my evil stepmother's legacy from the map. The very first thing I did was officially kill the old name. The grand veranda was completely tainted, associated with rotting seafood, federal health violations, and my stepbrother's arrogant incompetence. I legally filed the paperwork to rebrand the entire multi-million-dollar property as the Sovereign Table, a name that commanded absolute respect and proved that I was the one wearing the crown now. But changing the name on the front door wasn't enough. I had to completely rip out the terrible, tacky decorating choices Beatrice had made over the last decade. She loved loud, obnoxious luxury, so the dining room was originally filled with ugly red velvet chairs, massive gold mirrors that looked incredibly cheap, and heavy curtains that trapped the smell of stale food inside the room. I hired a massive crew of interior decorators and construction workers to work around the clock, completely gutting the dining room right down to the bare walls. We ripped up the old, stained carpets and replaced them with beautiful, dark, polished hardwood floors that gleamed under the lights. We took down the tacky gold mirrors and replaced them with sleek, modern glass, and we brought in brand new, custom-made leather seating that felt incredibly comfortable and looked like pure, refined money. I personally picked out heavy, expensive crystal wine glasses, brilliant white porcelain plates, and perfectly polished silver cutlery that shined so brightly it could practically blind you. Once the dining room looked like an absolute masterpiece, I locked myself inside my brand new, sparkling clean kitchen with my loyal executive sous chef and my 30 eager line cooks to create a menu that would absolutely blow the entire city away. We didn't sleep for almost 3 days straight. We drank gallons of strong black coffee, constantly testing, tasting, and perfecting every single dish until the flavors were absolutely flawless. I wanted a menu that Julian wouldn't even be able to read, let alone cook. For the appetizer, I designed a perfectly seared giant ocean scallop resting on a bed of sweet corn puree, topped with a delicate, foaming reduction of rare white truffles and a hint of fresh citrus glaze. For the main course, I completely threw away the cheap, rubbery steaks Julian used to serve. Instead, I brought in the incredibly expensive, beautifully marbled Wagyu beef from my own supply warehouses. We took massive, bone-in short ribs and slow-braised them in an expensive red wine and fresh herb bath for exactly 48 hours, until the meat was so incredibly tender you could cut it with a simple butter knife. We paired the beef with a rich, dark bone marrow reduction sauce that took over 12 hours to perfectly simmer down on the back stoves. For dessert, I created a complex, towering dome of spun caramel sugar that completely hid a rich, dark Belgian chocolate mousse resting on a crispy hazelnut crust. The food wasn't just dinner. It was high-end, absolute culinary art. Once the menu was locked in, and my cooks were trained to execute every single plate with military precision, it was time to set the final, public trap. I didn't just put an advertisement in the local newspaper or post on social media. I wanted this to be the most exclusive, hardest-to-get ticket in the entire state. I hired a boutique printing company to create heavy, beautiful black envelopes sealed with real, dripping gold wax. Inside the envelopes were thick, expensive cardboard invitations, offering a completely free 5-course VIP tasting menu for the grand reopening of the Sovereign Table. I very specifically targeted the exact people who had watched Beatrice and Julian fail. I sent an invitation directly to the desk of the famous, ruthless local food critic who had famously spit Julian's fake grocery store steak into a napkin. I sent an invitation to the city's mayor, the exact same man who had ignored Beatrice's desperate, crying phone calls when her power was shut off. I sent invitations to the wealthy socialites, the business council members, and all the rich country club friends who had completely abandoned my stepmother the second the health department locked her doors. I didn't put my name anywhere on the invitations. The entire city was completely buzzing with loud rumors, trying to guess which mysterious, billionaire celebrity chef had swooped in, bought the bankrupt property, and completely remodeled it in just a few short weeks. The mystery drove them absolutely crazy, and because rich people hate feeling left out of a secret, every single person who received a gold wax envelope immediately sent back an RSVP saying they would definitely attend. On the night of the grand reopening, the tension buzzing in the air was absolutely electric. The local news stations had actually parked their massive broadcast vans right across the street, pointing their bright camera lights at my new front doors. Inside the kitchen, it was a perfectly oiled machine. There was no screaming, no dropping knives, and absolutely no panic like there used to be when Julian was in charge. Every single cook was standing at their spotless prep station, wearing their crisp, bright white uniforms, holding their sharp knives. Completely quiet and waiting for my signal. I stood proudly at the stainless steel pass, the main counter where every single finished plate had to be checked before it went out to the dining room. I looked at the clock on the wall, saw that it was exactly 6 o'clock, and picked up the kitchen microphone. I looked around at my amazing, hardworking team, smiled a huge, genuine smile, and told the front house manager to finally unlock the heavy glass doors and let the lions into the dining room. The trap was perfectly set, the bait was incredibly delicious, and I was fully ready to walk out there and show the entire world exactly who the real master of the veranda empire always was. The heavy glass doors of the Sovereign Table officially swung open at exactly 6 o'clock, and the most powerful, wealthy people in the entire city cautiously stepped inside, fully expecting to see a disaster, but instantly walking into an absolute masterpiece of luxury, power, and unbelievable culinary perfection. Outside on the sidewalk, the bright camera flashes from the local news reporters were lighting up the night sky, desperately trying to get a glimpse of the mysterious billionaire chef who had bought the condemned restaurant. Inside the building, the atmosphere was completely transformed. The guests, including the city's mayor and the ruthless food critic who had famously spit out Julian's fake steak, walked onto the gleaming, dark hardwood floors and immediately stopped dead in their tracks. They remembered the ugly, tacky red velvet chairs and the cheap gold mirrors that Beatrice used to have, but all of that toxic garbage was completely gone. Instead, they were standing in a sleek, modern, beautifully designed dining room that felt like an incredibly expensive private club in New York or Paris. Soft, warm lighting reflected off the massive glass windows. The tables were draped in crisp, perfectly ironed white linen tablecloths, and the heavy silver cutlery shined so brightly it looked brand new. But the most important change wasn't the furniture. It was the smell. When Julian was running the kitchen, the dining room always smelled faintly of burnt cooking oil and cheap, stale, freezer-burned meat. Tonight, the air was filled with the rich, mouth-watering, intoxicating aroma of slow-braised beef, roasted garlic, fresh ocean saltwater, and expensive earthy truffles. The guests silently handed their expensive coats to the hostesses and took their seats, whispering to each other in absolute shock, desperately trying to guess who the secret genius in the kitchen could possibly be. As soon as every single VIP guest was seated, the real show finally began. The kitchen doors swung open, and an entire army of perfectly trained waiters marched out into the dining room in total, flawless synchronization. They were dressed in sharp black vests and crisp white shirts, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with the first appetizer course. They approached the tables and placed the pure white porcelain plates down at the exact same second. It was the perfectly seared, giant ocean scallop resting on a bed of sweet corn puree, topped with a delicate, foaming reduction of rare white truffles. The famous food critic sat at the very center table, holding his small black notebook and his pen, looking down at the plate with a highly skeptical expression. He picked up his heavy silver fork, cut a small piece of the scallop, dipped it into the truffle foam, and placed it into his mouth. The entire dining room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his reaction. The moment the incredible, complex flavors hit his tongue, the food critic physically froze. His eyes went wide. He slowly dropped his pen right onto the table, and he actually closed his eyes to savor the unbelievable taste. It was perfectly cooked, melting in his mouth like absolute butter, with the sweet corn and the rich, earthy truffle perfectly balancing the fresh, salty taste of the ocean. He didn't write down a single bad word. He just immediately took another massive bite, completely ignoring his notebook. Within 5 minutes, the entire dining room was filled with the sounds of silverware scraping against plates as the rich guests absolutely devoured the first course. But the real knockout punch came 2 hours later when the main course was finally served. The waiters marched back out carrying the slow-braised, bone-in Wagyu short ribs sitting in the dark, rich 12-hour bone marrow reduction sauce. The mayor of the city, a man who had eaten at the finest restaurants all over the world, took his knife and pressed it against the massive piece of expensive beef. He didn't even have to use any pressure. The incredibly tender meat completely fell apart right off the bone. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and looked across the table at his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Whispers started aggressively spreading across the entire dining room like wildfire. The guests were looking at each other, shaking their heads in total disbelief, loudly saying that Julian, the fake celebrity chef, could never, ever cook anything even remotely close to this level of perfection in a million years. They realized right then and there that the veranda group had always been a total scam, and whoever was currently standing in the kitchen was a true, undisputed master of the culinary arts. When the dessert course was finally finished and the empty plates were cleared away, the famous food critic simply couldn't take the mystery anymore. He stood up from his table, picked up his crystal wine glass, and loudly clinked his silver spoon against the side of it. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the quiet chatter, and the entire dining room instantly fell completely silent. The critic cleared his throat, looked toward the swinging metal doors of the kitchen, and loudly announced that he had been reviewing restaurants for 30 years, but he had never tasted a meal this perfect in his entire life. He demanded that the mysterious owner and executive head chef come out of the kitchen right this second, so the entire room could give them a standing ovation. Inside the kitchen, I was standing at the stainless steel counter, wiping my hands on a clean white towel. I looked at my loyal sous chef, smiled a massive, genuine smile, and nodded my head. I unbuttoned the very top button of my crisp, bright white, custom-tailored chef's coat, took a deep breath, and pushed the heavy metal kitchen doors open. I walked out into the middle of the beautiful dining room, the bright lights shining down on me, standing tall and incredibly proud. The reaction from the crowd was absolute, explosive chaos. The wealthy socialites, the business council members, and the mayor all gasped out loud, completely paralyzed by shock. They recognized my face immediately. They all knew me as Beatrice's quiet, awkward, marginalized kitchen assistant. They knew me as the stepdaughter who was constantly yelled at and treated like absolute garbage in the background of Julian's fake photo shoots. But now, they were looking at the bright red embroidery on the chest of my pristine white chef's coat that clearly said executive chef and owner, Alara. The food critic's jaw dropped straight to the floor as he finally connected all the puzzle pieces in his head. He realized in that exact moment that Beatrice and Julian were nothing but lying, talentless frauds, and that I was the actual, hidden genius who had built their entire empire from the very beginning. The room was totally silent for a few seconds as the massive reality check hit them all right in the face. And then, the food critic started to clap. He clapped loudly, standing right in front of his table. Then the mayor stood up and started clapping. Within 10 seconds, every single rich, powerful person in that dining room was standing on their feet, giving me a massive, deafening standing ovation, cheering and completely bowing down to the real, undisputed queen of the kitchen. I looked out at the clapping crowd, smiled my absolute brightest smile, and knew that the revenge was finally, completely, and perfectly served. The absolute, crushing reality of total defeat does not usually hit a narcissist all at once. It slowly suffocates them in the dark while they are forced to sit in total silence and watch the very person they abused completely take over the world. Exactly 5 miles away from the glowing, incredibly successful grand reopening of the Sovereign Table, Beatrice was sitting on the very edge of a lumpy, dangerously sagging mattress, inside a disgusting, roach-infested roadside motel room on the absolute worst side of town. The tiny, cramped room smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke, cheap industrial bleach, and deep, unadulterated failure. The flickering red neon sign from the motel parking lot was buzzing loudly right outside her dirty, unwashed window, casting a harsh, ugly light across her exhausted, pale face. She was still wearing the exact same wrinkled designer clothes she had on when the county sheriffs physically threw her out of her multi-million-dollar suburban mansion. But those clothes were now covered in dirt and sweat, completely ruined just like her fake, stolen legacy. Julian was fast asleep on the other stained mattress across the tiny room, snoring loudly, wrapped in a cheap, scratchy wool blanket because they couldn't even afford to turn the motel room heater on. Beatrice reached over to the sticky wooden nightstand with shaking hands, grabbed the cheap plastic television remote, and turned on the tiny, broken television sitting on the cheap dresser. She desperately wanted to watch the local news, secretly hopping to see a report that Alara's grand reopening was a total disaster and that the health department had shut the building down again. But the moment the television screen crackled to life, Beatrice's heart completely stopped beating in her chest. Every single local news station in the entire city was broadcasting live, high-definition footage directly from the beautiful, glowing dining room of the Sovereign Table. The camera panned across the crowded room, showing the mayor, the wealthy socialites, and the famous business council members all standing on their feet, clapping their hands and cheering with absolute joy. And right there in the center of the screen, standing perfectly under the bright, expensive crystal chandeliers, was Alara. She was wearing her pristine, bright white, custom-tailored executive chef's coat, smiling a genuine, massive smile, looking like a true, undisputed billionaire queen who completely owned the entire city. The news anchor's voice echoed through the dirty, silent motel room, and every single word felt like a sharp, heavy dagger being slowly twisted directly into Beatrice's chest. The anchor excitedly announced that the mysterious new owner was none other than the brilliant, hidden genius of the original Veranda Group, and that the famous local food critic had just officially declared her the absolute greatest culinary master of her entire generation. But the news report didn't stop there. The anchor pulled up an old, embarrassing photograph of Julian wearing his fake chef coat and publicly told the entire city the absolute truth. The anchor revealed that Julian and his mother Beatrice had been completely exposed as massive, talentless frauds who had nearly killed their own customers by serving rotting, expired grocery store food while illegally stealing credit for Alara's amazing recipes. Beatrice watched the television screen in pure, paralyzed horror as the entire city laughed at her, realizing that she wasn't just broke and homeless. She was officially a massive, humiliating public joke who could never, ever show her face in high society ever again. She dropped the cheap plastic remote onto the dirty carpet, covered her face with her shaking, wrinkled hands, and finally started crying the most bitter, painful, and absolute tears of total defeat she had ever experienced in her entire life. She had tried to throw her stepdaughter away like a piece of useless garbage, but that exact same stepdaughter had secretly bought the garbage truck, purchased the landfill, and buried Beatrice underneath the heavy, crushing weight of her own massive incompetence. Back at the restaurant, the grand reopening party was finally winding down. The last of the wealthy VIP guests had shaken my hand, paid their massive bills, and walked out the front doors with giant smiles on their faces, already begging the hostesses to let them book another reservation for the following weekend. The kitchen was completely spotless, the floors were mopped, and my incredibly loyal staff had gone home with massive, heavy envelopes full of thick cash bonuses in their pockets. I walked up the quiet, carpeted stairs to the private executive office on the second floor, the exact same office my father used to use when he first built his empire. I sat down in his massive, comfortable leather chair, poured myself a glass of incredibly expensive, perfectly aged red wine, and looked out the massive glass window at the quiet, sleeping city. I had done exactly what I promised myself I would do while I was standing out there in the freezing cold alleyway next to the dumpsters. I had systematically, legally, and mercilessly dismantled the toxic parasites who had stolen my father's legacy, and I had rebuilt his empire to be 10 times stronger, 10 times richer, and absolutely bulletproof. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my expensive wine, smiled at my reflection in the dark glass window, and knew that the kitchen was finally, permanently safe. If you have been captivated by this monumental, 13-part epic saga of toxic family betrayal, secret offshore trust funds, high-stakes forensic supply chain takeovers, and the ultimate calculated destruction of an incredibly arrogant, fake celebrity chef, then you are the exact reason I document these massive, satisfying retaliatory operations. You have witnessed the exact, mathematical failure of a toxic bully's ego and the glorious, unstoppable rise of a sovereign culinary architect who absolutely refused to yield a single inch of her rightful kingdom. If you love long, detailed, and incredibly satisfying revenge stories where the quiet person doing all the hard work finally completely destroys the lazy people taking all the credit, then you are in the perfect place. Smash that like button right now, absolutely destroy that subscribe button for the Revenge Room, and make sure you permanently activate your bell notifications so you never, ever miss a single instance of spectacular, high-definition karma being served freezing cold. Tell me down in the comments what you would have done if your evil stepmother tried to throw you out of your own family business, and share this massive video with anyone who needs a serious reminder that you should never, ever underestimate the quiet person in the room. I have finished serving my final dish. The critics have given their perfect reviews, and the result is absolute, undeniable perfection. I will see you guys in the next epic story.